Hello and welcome or welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I'm going to be sharing with you all of my five-star reads. Well, I guess not all of them. All of my five-star reads that are classics, the classic novels I would most recommend, all of the above. So I'm sharing with you just about every five-star read that I've had that falls into the genre of classic literature, as defined by the story graph, because that's how I sorted it. And I've decided to divide this up into four categories. So the best books or my favorite books that I would recommend for people just getting into classics, books for those who want to explore more classics or maybe willing to read longer books, books that are classics that I think are kind of a twist and things that you wouldn't expect in classic literature, and then a few honorable mentions, which are all the books that on Storygraph weren't rated 4 stars, and I questioned why. So let me go ahead and get started. For all of the books that I mention, I'm just going to mention the title, the author. I'll try and put a picture of it up on the screen if I can find one. And then I'm just going to do a very short explanation as to why I would recommend this particular book, because there's a lot of them, and if I went into detail on every single one of them and what they're about, it would take forever. I highly recommend just looking up these books. They are all great, and I would recommend all of them. So let's go ahead and get started with the first category, which would be books that I would recommend for, beginners, or really just anyone who is nervous about starting reading classic literature. Maybe you've tried it before and you picked up a book and you were like, what is this? Why do people like classics? And have just run away and decided never to read one ever again. The reason I have picked most of these books is regardless of whether they were written 100 years ago or 150 or 200 years ago or whatever, they are all books that I feel like read slightly more like modern literature does, usually involves simpler language. Or they're books that have really good translations of them that are into modern English as opposed to like Victorian English or something like that, which, if you speak English, won't feel that modern anymore. So basically, they're just books that have a lot fewer barriers to entry, if you will, in my opinion. Mileage may vary, so keep that in mind. The first book that I'm going to recommend is Howard's End by EM Forster. This is a book that I recently read, and it is a really fascinating book with lots of themes, very witty and just I don't know if I want to say fun, but it's pretty well paced and there's just a lot of interesting topics and conversations going on. It's Edwardian as opposed to Victorian in terms of the time period. So I think there's just a lot more about this book that will feel familiar to today's reader. And I don't think it's very difficult to read as things go. So I think this is a great place to start, and it has a great movie adaptation. So what's not to like about that? Next, I'd recommend Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck. This is a very short read because sometimes with classic literature, that is a problem that people have, is the books are really long and hard to get into. John Steinbeck writes beautifully, uncomplicated language, but Of Mice and Men covers a story that involves friendship and just a lot of themes that are really universal and a fairly simple, almost short story kind of feel to it. And again, there's a great movie adaptation of this book. I would also highly recommend A Long Fatal Love Chase by Louisa May Alcott. Now, most people are probably thinking of her book and maybe familiar with her book, Little Women. However, that's a slower paced book, and I personally prefer A Long Fatal Love Chase. I had never heard of this book until just this year, and this book is really fast paced and was actually marketed in the 90s as sort of a domestic thriller, if you will, and I think it lives up to that. So if you like domestic thrillers, if you like thrillers in general, you will probably like this book. She was actually challenged by her publishers to make sure in writing this book that at least every other chapter ended on a very high, tense cliffhanger type of moment. And I think she succeeded. So this book is extremely fast paced. And I think you will find once you pick it up, you won't want to put it down. I will warn you, the beginning may be a little cheesier than you like, but if you continue reading, you will probably be happily surprised. Continuing with short books, I would recommend Animal Farm by George Orwell. Most people have heard of his book 1984 as well as Animal Farm. And I would say before trying 1984, especially if you don't read a lot of classics or books with a lot of philosophical or political ideas in them, start with Animal Farm. It's a much shorter story. It's told in an allegorical form, so there are symbols for everything. And I think without even knowing what he was responding to in writing about, there are still a lot of things that any reader could pick up on in reading this book. And it's talking animals. Who doesn't like that? Well, people who tried to get book banned didn't like that. But besides them, who doesn't like talking animals? Like in Charlotte's Web. We all like Charlotte's Web. Come on, guys. Anyway, I would highly recommend this book. It is a very easy read, very quick read. You could probably read it in a day or over a weekend. And honestly, the writing style is simple enough that while they might not get all the themes and things that are being discussed, even a child could potentially hear this book and understand some of what's going on and also be able to point out some of the right and wrongs that happen. Going back to books with the more thriller vibe to them, if you like dark novels or psychological thrillers, I would recommend Rebecca by Daphne DuMaurier. This is a very mysterious book that just has strange things happening, very atmospheric. Don't get bogged down in the beginning description. Once you get into the narrative voice and she gets going in her story, you will follow her until the end, and you will just meet some interesting characters as you go along. So I highly recommend this book if you want to get more on the Gothic side and maybe aren't ready to read Jane Eyre or Wuthering Heights, which frankly didn't make it onto this list, so I wouldn't blame you. And my final pick for this category would be Miss or Mrs. by Wilkie Collins. This is a very short I guess novella by Wilkie Collins that I almost never hear anyone mention. And I think this is a great introduction into Victorian literature, particularly the sensation genre and the writing of Wilkie Collins. It's a very short book. It's not his best work, but I think for such a short story, you get a perfect flavor of what his writing style is like, what sort of the more dramatic Victorian writing style is like. It's a very easy read. It's a quick read. It's thrilling. It's exciting. You just go from moment to moment, kind of like in A Long Fatal Love Chase. But he also manages to talk about some very deep, meaningful themes, and his characters are extremely fascinating. And he packs a lot into this very short book. So if you want to try some Victorian authors, or maybe you want to participate in Victober, but you're not ready to bite off some of those 600-page books that they write, I'd recommend starting here. All right, that brings me to section two. And this is a set of books where if you just want to explore more classics, maybe you've read some of those at the beginning, or maybe you've read some classics and you just want to keep reading some more. These are books that I have read and loved by some fairly well-known authors. Also, a lot of them are on the longer side. So maybe you've read sort of their typical stories and you want to read more of them. I would recommend all of these. So first up, going back to Wilkie Collins, if you read Miss or Mrs. and you really enjoy his writing and you want to read more like that, my two favorite of his are The Woman in White, which is a really well-known book by him. It is definitely on the longer side and has a slower start and is slower throughout all of the book than Miss or Mrs., but is still a really intriguing story with some good mysterious stuff happening in it. If you want to continue with Wilkie Collins and maybe you've read The Moonstone and The Woman in White and you just want to read more of his other major novels, I liked No Name the best. I thought it was a perfect example of the sensation novel where everything starts with a wonderful family and then it just blows up and goes to crap. He's excellent at writing those novels, and you just have no idea where this book is going to go or how it's going to end. If you're looking for something that is just a lighthearted, fun read and you want to know what this British wit is all about, then I would recommend Three Men in a Boat by Jerome K. Jerome. So I think this is a great way to explore other Victorian authors and other styles of writing outside your typical sort of social commentary or sensational writing. This is just pure fun and hilarity. Sticking with Victorian authors, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention something by Charles Dickens, and I, of course, am going to talk about David Copperfield. This, thus far, is my favorite novel of all time, but as well as in the genre of classic literature. And I think this is actually an excellent place to start if you're reading Charles Dickens. It is one of his longer books, and it is a bit slower paced, but all of his books kind of are. The reason that I would recommend this is the same reason that I picked it up first, which is it's a first person narrator. And you stick with the titular character, David, for the entire book. And he tells you just his entire story. And the reason that's important is because a lot of Charles Dickens' other works actually feature a lot of different points of view. And some people, no matter the genre, don't like multiple points of view in a story because they end up liking one of the stories better than one of the other stories, and it all goes to crap from there. So, David Copperfield, that's a good one to start. Way better than Great Expectations, in my opinion. If you enjoyed A Long Fatal Love Chase or Mr. Mrs., or you just like thrillers, or you like adventures, or you like stories with just a whole ton of drama and twists and turns and stuff just happening all the time, I recommend The Count of Monte Cristo. This is a humongous book, but I promise you, if you let yourself get into it, you will read the entire thing. Do not get it abridged. You don't want to miss it out. I couldn't figure out for the life of me what they could have possibly cut from this book that I would have been okay with. It is a great story. It is so fun. I don't know. It's fun to read, even though the stuff that's happening in it is sometimes sort of dark and disturbing. But it is way more than a story of a revenge, though it is that as well. It's really a story about justice and who gets to decide what justice is and looks like, and how do you bring that about? Can you bring it about? So, yeah, I highly recommend that by Alexander Dumas, and I think it's a great time. I have two books to recommend if you want a twist on sort of the regular idea of classic literature. One would be The Mystery of Edwin Drood by Charles Dickens. This is actually an unfinished work by him. It was one of the last books that he was working on before he died. In fact, he died right after getting up from a table while editing it. So, how's that for a strange situation? But the reason I actually recommend this book is I think it's very different than your typical Charles Dickens, though it gives you a flavor of his writing, but it's a very complex story. And for as short a book as it is, it's supposedly only about one-fifth of the length that he intended it to be. You get really sucked in. And for it to be unfinished, the ending is actually fairly satisfying. And I love the fact that you're kind of left kind of wondering what actually did happen. Another classic that I would recommend is a book that I'm pretty sure I've never heard anyone on YouTube talk about, and that would be Oreo by Fran Ross. This is a work of classic literature following an African American woman around the city in a almost sort of Don Quixote adventure travel journal going through the streets. I'm sure there's some other book that's like this, but maybe not. This is the oddest character study and book I have read in a long time, but I loved it. And my one tip in reading this book, because it is a bit of a challenge, is read those section headings because you will need them as you get to each part of this book. And there are a lot of parts of this book, but you need to follow it all. And it's great. But this is definitely one that is a twist on the regular idea of what classic literature is and looks like. So you might want to take your time with it. Another book that I'm going to add on here is Things Fall Apart. And this is a book that I actually meant to include in the Explore More section. And that's because I think it's important to explore classic works of literature outside of the Western canon. This is a work of Nigerian fiction and tells the story of the change that occurred in Nigeria during colonization. It is a very powerful story told in three parts, and it's important to keep that in mind as you read. First, you are invited into this traditional Nigerian village. And then as it progresses through the next two parts, you get to see how things fall apart, if you will. And finally, I have to include some honest mentions, honorable mentions. I don't know what you want to call them. They're basically the books that I found that were on my story graph that almost were rated 5 stars. And in looking back, I can't think why I didn't rate them 5 stars because I think about these books all the time. And I would definitely still recommend them. So in no particular order, here's the rest of them. Don Quixote by Cervantes, really long, really fun, very strange, but really meaningful too. Peter Pan, a children's book, but with some great things to think about as an adult. So, really, a book you could read to the whole family. The Romance of the Forest. Everything I love about the sensation and Gothic novels brought together in a fairly easy to read, high paced book that just had one part in the middle that I personally didn't like, but probably won't bother most people. Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I love this book and I recommend it all the time, so I don't know why I gave it like a 4 or 4.5 stars. I think I must have been having an off day. But this book is not what you think if you've seen any of the movies on Frankenstein, but is just a really thought-provoking look at how society acts towards others. Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Thomas Hardy. This was one of my favorite Thomas Hardy novels, and I believe is the only one that I gave 5 stars to, or no, I gave it 4.75 stars. I don't know what that was. I think this one also had some small moment in the middle of the book that I personally didn't like, and I just need to get over myself. This is partially why I stopped giving books partial ratings, because the truth is, I should have just given it 5 stars. This is sort of everything that Thomas Hardy is and all his novels are wrapped up into one and done to perfection. And if you don't know what that means, it's just sad, dramatic, and really thought provoking. The Woodlanders by Thomas Hardy. I also did not give this book a 5-star rating, and I should have because I actually liked this better than Tess, and it's the one that I don't know, feel like I connected the most with of his books, and I've read quite a few of them at this point. So if you're gonna read Thomas Hardy and you're not a fan or don't understand the settings of his other books that happen on the Heath and in the Heather and other settings that we just don't have here in the US, or maybe we do, but we call them something else. If you live in any other part of the world other than the UK, I'd recommend The Woodlanders. It happens in the woods, and most places have woods, so that might be helpful. Moby Dick. I can't believe I didn't give this book 5 stars. I'm kind of looking at past me like, what were you doing, Nicole? What were you thinking? Did you read these books? Did you actually think about your ratings? I don't know, but it didn't get a 5 stars. And I mention and think about Moby Dick a lot. I really want to reread this book, which for me is usually something that is necessary for it to get a 5-star rating. And yeah, I enjoyed every crazy, insane moment of this book. Every chapter I got to just made me go, "What is this? And what is happening?" And I loved it for no good reason. And I started out reading this book intentionally because I thought I would dislike it. And I don't know, did I hate read it? Not almost. But I ended up loving it, which I felt like was the weirdest twist of all. Like, I couldn't put it down. I kept bothering my family about it. I would read passages to them out loud repeatedly. And then I'd make them also listen to the audiobook with me in the car. So, yeah, Moby Dick. And if you want to try something by Alexander Dumas, but maybe The Count of Monte Cristo is way too long, I'd recommend The Lady of the Camillas, which ironically is not by Dumas, but is written by his son. They have somewhat similar writing styles. This is a really interesting sort of narrative story where you have a young man telling about the love of his life and the tragic mistakes that he made with her. And it is beautiful at one point and then gets dark and creepy and sad as heck. Like, this book, honestly, in my opinion, gives Thomas Hardy a run for his money. And finally, one of my favorite classics of all time, War and Peace. Again, I think I gave this a 4. I think I gave this 4 stars because the last time I read it, I just didn't want to go through all of his thoughts on war at the end of the book. But I have before and I enjoyed it. So, and I do think about War and Peace a lot. I love the overall encompassing story in that book. There are elements in it that I really like when he even gets into the more sort of philosophical and essay side of it. And yeah, I just think it's a really enjoyable read and worth mentioning. I should mention that all of these honest mentions that I've just quickly gone through are books that I would not necessarily recommend to everyone, which is why I didn't start the video with them and I'm ending with them instead. They all have things in them that I feel like are somewhat divisive, not in terms of content, but just in terms of people are going to be really split over. Like, you're either going to love some of these elements or you're going to hate it. And that tends to be true. So, like, all of those might be books that you may DNF, and if you do, it's fine. So, that is my total list of all the classics that I have loved, that I have read in the last couple of years, and that I would recommend to everyone, or the last ones to most people. And yeah, let me know if you have read any of these. Let me know if you feel like I missed some. And more importantly, let me know what your favorite classics are, especially if they're not on this list, because I need to add those to my TBR. So I will talk to you next time. Bye. If you enjoyed a long fatal long fatal lunches, if gonna cause controversy, I think. No, not controversy.